Swifter, this is the 5th video for our TableView School. In this one, we're going to handle passing data from one view controller that has a table view in it to another view controller where we can either edit the item that we clicked on or create and add a new element for that table view. Then when you click on save, we're going to segue back, perform an unwind, and either update the value that we clicked on or add a new value to the end of the table view. There'll be a challenge at the end where you can try it out using party planner data. Let's do it. Now up next, we're going to pass data over. Now if you think about our app when it's running, the only time we're going to pass data over is when we click on a row in our table view. Because if we click on plus, we're not passing over any data, we're going to create a new element. So again, the only time we're going to be passing data over is when we click on a table view cell. That means that this segue is executing the one that we've named show detail. Now this is going to be significant when we write some code in just a bit. But before we can pass anything over, we've got to make sure that we've got a variable over here that can catch whatever we're passing. Right now we don't have anything in this view controller. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a data structure to catch what we're passing over. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to put a data structure in here to catch whatever we're passing over. Now in the first case, when we're passing over a student, this is passing over an element of an array of strings. So this should be a value that can catch a single string. When you work on Party Planner, you're actually passing over not an element of a string, but an element of your custom struct that you created, which we called Party Planner list item. But for now, let's worry about creating a string over here that can catch the student name that you're passing over. This is how we're going to do it. We want to make sure that we've created an IB outlet for the field so that we can display the data that we're passing over. We also want to make sure that we've created a value to catch the string that we're passing over. So we're going to call this student, and it's going to be a string. And what we're going to do in viewDidLoad is we're going to check to see if student is nil. If it's not nil, that must mean that we've passed it over. Now I'm going to show you how we're going to pass it over in just a bit, but we have to do this part ahead of ourselves where we set up the thing to catch before we can actually pass the value over. Now the reason why we say if student equals nil is if we haven't passed over a value, student is going to be nil, but we have to make sure that we set student to an empty string so that our code doesn't crash. So that's why we perform this check here. This will execute only if you clicked on the plus button because we haven't passed a value over. Down here, either we've set the student to the empty string or we've got a value that we've passed over. In either case, we're going to update student name field.text equal to student. What's going to change? The stuff in green. The name of any user interface elements. In our case, it's student name text field, so that's why this is underlined. The variable that's going to be catching any data that's passed over to it. So we're passing over a single string from an array of strings, so that's why we've created this here. And then you're checking to see if this value that you're passing over is nil, and if it is, you're setting it equal to an empty string. Then you're taking this value, either it's an empty string or it's the value you've passed over, and you're updating your interface elements with whatever's inside of this. So let's do it. In our student detail view controller, we'll create the variable that's going to catch what we're passing over. We're passing over an element from an array of strings, so we'll call this student colon, and that'll be a string, implicitly unwrapped optional with an exclamation point. Then down here we're going to say, hey, do we have something inside of this? So we'll say if student equals nil. If it does equal nil, then we didn't pass anything over, which must mean we clicked on the plus, which means, hey, let's just put an empty string in here for starters. So we'll go inside these curlies of the if statement and say student equals empty string. Now either we've got an empty string in here or we've got the value that we appropriately passed over. We need to now set student text field dot text equal to student. So this sets up our catch value. How do we pass something over? Well, when you click on a particular field, well, this is the code we're going to write to be able to pass data over when you click on a cell in your table view. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a function called prepare for segue. This is an Apple function, and iOS will look for this anytime a segue is executing. And if any segue is about to execute, just before performing that segue, it will execute what's inside of the prepare for segue. So if I click on a table view cell, show detail segue will execute. If I click on the plus sign here, the add detail segue will execute. In either case, if I put a prepare for segue inside of my view controller code, this code will execute. So what do I want to do? Well, just before I segue, I want to check to see, hey, which segue am I executing? Is it show detail or is it add detail? If it's show detail, then I want to pass over a value. So what I'm going to do is prepare for segue has a single parameter. It's a storyboard segue. So this type is just a segue. We're passing in a segue. It's called segue. So we're going to say if the segue.identifier is show detail, that must mean that you've clicked on a table view cell because that executes the show detail segue. If it does, then what we're going to do is we're going to get the destination, the view controller we're going to. So we're going to create a constant called destination. We could call it anything, but destination is a good name. We're going to say the destination equals segue.destination. And if you option click on top of destination, this will tell you it's a view controller. Now that's cool because we're going to a view controller, but we are not going to just any view controller. We want to make sure that it knows it's going to a view controller that has our student value that we're going to catch. Not every view controller has that. Just a detail view controller has that student variable. So that's why we're going to take segue.destination and make sure that it's not just a view controller, but it's treated as a detail view controller. So this will subclass it so that it's got not only just the view controller stuff, but all the extra stuff, including the variable over here, student. Now, why are we doing this? As soon as we know we've clicked on this to segue over, and that our destination is going to be the detail view controller, then we want to figure out which row we clicked on. Now, the way that we can figure out which row or which cell in the table view cell we clicked on is we can say TableView.index path for selected row. So that says what is the index path for the row that was selected. Now, if you call this, there's a chance that you might not have clicked on a cell. But we know whenever we call this, we absolutely have clicked on a cell, because the only way that you can execute show detail is if you've clicked on a cell or clicked on a row. So we can force unwrap this thing that's otherwise normally an optional. We know it's always going to, the only way show detail is going to execute is if we've clicked on a cell. So we're going to force unwrap it. Then we have the name of the index path. This is an index path that you've clicked on. So we can say go into students, our array that has all of the student names in here. Go into the selected index path, and remember how we get into the specific row. We need to add the dot row to the selected index path. That's going to find the string in the cell that you clicked on. Once we have that, we're going to pass that into destination, which is this view controller, and dot student is our catch variable that we set up. So that's going to pass the value over. Now, if we didn't segue over from show detail, that must mean that we clicked on the plus here. Now, this might not be clear why we've written this little bit of code in here, and notice we don't have any green next to it, so we're not going to change this code at all from project to project. But the reason why we've got this code in here is if you click on plus, we want to make sure that we don't have any residual selection from clicking on a previous cell. And the reason why we're doing that is when we finally come back, we're going to take a look when we come back from this direction and say, hey, is there a selection? If there is, then we'll update what we've edited. But if there's no selection, that must mean we clicked on the plus button because we cleared out any existing selection when we click on the plus button. So that's why we get rid of the selection. I'll mention this again when we get to it, but look what changes in here. You might have a different segue name, you might have a different view controller name, and you'll have a different name for the data structure that holds all of the array elements, as well as the name of the data structure that catches one of those elements. Everything else will remain the same. You got a software Lego. Let's write this code. So inside our view controller, this is the view controller that contains the table view. We're going to add a prepare for segue. We'll do that right after view did load. Before the close curly for our class, we'll say prepare, select the one that says for segue. This is an Apple function. It executes just before any segue is performed. We don't need to change any of the values that are passed in here, but what we'll do is we'll check to see which segue is being performed. So we can say if segue.identifier to look for the identifier of the segue. And if this equals show detail, and again, where does show detail come from? That's the name of this segue. Remember, we gave it an identifier name, which you see right here in storyboard segue. So if this is the case, we want to get the destination and put that in a constant. So we'll say let destination equals segue.destination. This is the destination view controller for the segue. Notice this is of type UI view controller. So I'm going to press enter here. That will mean our destination is of type UI view controller, which is kind of good, but it's not good enough for us because we're not just going to any view controller. We're specifically going to show detail view controller, and that specifically has student. So if we didn't do this, we wouldn't be able to access the student value inside of it. So that's why in here we say as exclamation point to turn our destination and make sure that our destination value over here is a student detail view controller. Once we do this, then we're going to be able to set the value inside of our destination for student. But first, let's figure out what cell you clicked on. Now, whenever you click on a cell, that's when the show detail fires. This segue here. Now, there is an attribute of TableView that's index path for selected row, which will tell us which row was clicked on. So I can go over here and inside of my view controller prepare for segue, inside my if statement, I'm going to create a variable let selected index path equals, and if I type TableView index path for selected row, this is the index path identifying the row and the section for the selected row. Now we have no section in our table view, but we do have rows. And notice that this is an optional because you might check this and sometimes there wasn't a selection. But we know every time we check this, there is going to be a selection because we've already checked to see are we inside of the show detail, not details, show detail. And so I can force unwrap this. I am going to make sure that I spell this properly with detail and not details. So I'll go back to main storyboard, look again. Yep, it's show detail. There's no S in there. My code wouldn't have worked if I had that extra S, so that's important to remember. I caught a potential error that would have been really hard to diagnose. And so now I know where I'm going. I have the destination. I know what I clicked on. That's the index path. So I can say destination dot, and now if I type in student, it knows that there's a student value. How come? Because my destination value is of type student detail view controller. If I option click on it, that's what this as statement did. So I'm going to set destination student equal to what? My students array, and specifically I want to go into students and I want to get the element that's at selected index path. Now remember, this is my index path. I still need to say dot row afterward. But once I've done this, I've grabbed a value and I've set this and updated things when I pass over. Now there's one other thing that I have here which has nothing to do with passing data over, but what we're going to do is we're going to check to see, hey, was there a selected index path? If you haven't clicked on show detail, you clicked on add. And remember, if you clicked on add, then what we want to do is we want to make sure that there's no residual selection left over in our table view. So we're going to deselect if there is any existing selection. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back over here. And the reason why this would happen would be if you clicked on to edit, say, some student's name, and then you added a name afterward. Well, the student's name that you clicked on would still be lingering as a selection. So we want to make sure that we get rid of that when you click on plus. How come? Because when we come back, you'll see in another few slides, we're going to check to see, hey, was there an item that's selected? If it is, we'll update that. Otherwise, we must be coming back after adding a new record, and so we'll add the record to the bottom. But back here in our view controller, what we'll do is we'll say if let. So if let checks to see if something's nil. And we'll say selected index path equals table view index path for selected row. open and close curlies. So what this statement does is it checks to see, hey, is there a valid non-nil index path for selected row? If there is, it puts it in selected index path. If it doesn't, it does not perform what's inside the curlies. So if it's true that we have a selected index path, then what we're going to do in here is we're simply going to say TableView deselect row at what index path? Well, it's going to be selected index path. So it wants just an index path, not the row, just the selected index path. And then animated will say true. That's it. So what's going to change when you go ahead and do this with another app? Well, you might have a different identifier. You'll have a different destination. You'll have a different class type for the destination. And you'll likely have a different catch value and a different array of data structures in this view controller. But other than that, this same prepare for segue function is what you'll have in the view controller that's got the table view. Let's build and run and see if this is working. So here we are. If I want to click on, and let me get rid of my bezel so that I can copy stuff over a little bit easier. And now if I want to click on the Mother of Dragons and pass her over, what's going to happen is I'm going to click on this. This is going to execute a segue. Before the segue is executed, it will execute prepare for segue in this view controller. It will check to see, hey, which segue was selected? Well, if I clicked on a row in the table view, it must have been show detail. At which point I'll find my destination and I'll set it to student detail view controller. I'll get the index path that was selected with table view index path for selected row. That's this one right in here. And then I'll say students selected index path dot row, which will give me the value 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because this is the 6th element at index 5. I'll grab that, which is the string Daenerys Targaryen, and I'll place that in my destination view controller, which is my student detail view controller, dot student. Boom! That's what happened right here. Click on cancel. What happens when I click on plus? Well, before I click on plus and execute my present modally segue, prepare for segue executes again. Any segue executes prepare for segue before performing the segue. It checks to see the segue identifier. Is it show detail? Not if I click on plus. This is add detail. So I skip this. I take a look and say, hey, is there a selected index path? And in fact, there is. See how Daenerys Targaryen is still selected? But watch what happens when I click on plus. You don't see the deselection happen, but when we click on cancel, when we come back, Daenerys is not selected. Perfect! Now it's your turn. Now continue updating your party planner, and the first thing that you need to do is in viewcontroller.swift, you want to cut out the struct party planner list item and move it into its own Swift file. You want to cut it out, not just copy it. As a hint, you did the same thing in to-do lists. So if you forgot how, you might want to go over and take a look at your to-do list really quickly to make sure that you know how to do this. Otherwise, that will be the first step that I show you, and then you can make sure, and you should be able to do all of these other steps because we just performed them. Then what you want to do in your Party Planner app is when a row was selected in the table view, you want to grab the element of Party Planner list. That's the array that shows all of the different data structures inside of each row. I want to figure out which one was selected and then load that into our detail view controller. So what are we going to need to do? Well, you're going to need to create 2 IB outlets for your item text field. That's the first one in here, and your person responsible text field in here as well. Now we also want to create a variable that's going to catch the element of your party planner list. That's what you clicked on in the table view here. Remember, that's going to be of type party planner list item. And so why don't we call that party planner list item lower camel case in this view controller, your detail view controller. That's your catch item. It's similar to the string that you used in your student list, but this is going to be this data structure here. Then in your detail view controller, you're going to add a prepare for segue. It's going to behave just like the previous one, But when an item in the table view was clicked, you're going to grab an item out of the party planner list and send it to the detail view controller. So your data structure is changing. Your array, the name of the value you're sending it to, and the name of your destination view controller. If you click on the plus, you want to make sure that you check to see if you passed over nil and then initialize the properties of your party planner list item to empty strings. Then you want to update the interface so you're either showing the empty strings or the values you passed over in party item and person responsible. If you need to, go back and refer to your student list to get this done. Pause. I know you can do it. Let's see how you did. Now, the first thing I told you to do was to cut out that struct party planner list item and move it to its own Swift file. So let's do that. I'm going to highlight this data structure. And the reason why we're doing this is because I defined it inside of this view controller, but I want to make sure that it's available in this view controller as well. Because inside here, we have an array of this data structure, but I'm also going to want to have a single element of this data structure in here because that's going to be my catch value. So I'm going to highlight the struct, cut it out, just under screendelegate.swift. I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a Swift file. I'm going to call this party planner list item upper camel case because it's a type. That's what a custom struct is. I'll just paste this in. And now that I've created this, if I do a Shift Command K, it will recognize this is a valid value. Now, if we go back over here and see what our next step is, we want to update the app so that we grab the element that was clicked on and pass it over to the detail view controller, but we need to create IB outlets for our party item name and our person responsible. We'll call that item text field and person responsible. So in my party planner, click on detail view controller, option click on main storyboard, so I'm in assistant editor mode. Click on my party item, drag it over into my detail view controller. I'll call this item text field. It's a UI text field. And then I'll call this one here. I'll click on this text field, control drag over, call this person responsible text field, drag that one over. Now I've created my outlets. I need to create a catch value to catch an element of party planner list. That's what's inside of my table view that I'm passing over. And I want to call this party planner list item lower camel case, and it's of type party planner list item upper camel case. So in just the same way, if I take a look at my student detail view controller and I created a catch variable that was var student string, and all of these values were in a string array, well, here, all of these values are eventually going to be inside of a party planner list item array. So I am going to pass over a single party planner list item. So I'm going to say in here, var, I'll give it the name in lower camel case, party planner list item, colon, and it'll be party planner list item. It's a single element of that array I'm passing over. I'll make it an implicitly unwrapped optional. Then what do I do in here? The same thing I had done previously, where I check to see if something is nil and I update my data structures. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to say if party planner list item equals nil. If it is, then I need to set the values equal to empty strings. So I can just say party planner list item equals capital party planner list item, open parentheses, and pass in empty strings for both of these. Then I'm going to update my user interface. Over here, it was just student text field. Over here, I've got two items. I've got item text field dot text, and that's going to equal party planner list item dot item, and I also have my person responsible text field dot text, and I'm going to set that equal to party planner list item dot person responsible. So this piece is done. Again, just like this. Catch value, check to see if it's nil. If it is nil, set any values equal to empty values or initial values, then update the interface. Here's our catch value. Here's our check for the nil. Here is our updating of values to replace the nil. And here's where we update our interface. Now what do we need to do? In our view controller, we've got to set up or prepare for segue. And we've got our software Lego to leverage for that. It's going to be almost identical to what we did in our view controller in student list. We write a prepare for segue. We check to see what the identifier is. If we're doing our show detail, which is our show segue, we want to set the destination. We want to get the index path for the selected row. We want to update the catch value in our destination with the value in our array that was clicked on. Otherwise, we want to make sure that we've deselected a value. And in fact, to show you how replaceable this is, I'm just going to highlight my whole prepare for segue function, copy it, go over here into my view controller.swift, paste it in. Now we want to check to make sure that our identifier is in fact called show detail. So I'll go over to main storyboard here. This is my show segue. Is it called show detail? It is. So I'll just make sure that I've copied that and pasted it in here, but I can see visually it's called show detail. What about my destination controller? Well, Xcode's complaining because I don't have a student detail view controller here. I have a detail view controller, so I've just changed that. Now my selected index path is found the same way. There's nothing specific to the data structures or values in this project. But for my destination, I'm not updating anything called student. I'm updating a value that's called party planner list item. And I'm getting that from an array which is called party planner list. But I'm still getting the index path at selected row. This should work when I build and run. Let's see. What happens when I click on salsa? It's passed over. What happens if I want to add a value? I can create that new value. And the selection is deselected. Perfect. Hopefully you got that. If not, review the video. Let's keep going. Now let's figure out how we pass data back. Now it's a little bit tricky in terms of the steps, but the steps are going to be identical each time we do what we're doing here, which is either taking a value that we've saved that's a new value or updating an existing value that we clicked on and we passed over. So what happens is when you click on the Save button, we're first going to execute Prepare for Segue. And in the Prepare for Segue, that's going to be inside of this. Now, we already wrote a Prepare for Segue in this view controller. Now we're going to put one in this view controller. And what this is going to do is it's going to grab anything out of the user interface elements that the user may have updated or entered new. We're going to update the catch value that we had set before. Then we're going to execute our segue. Now, notice we don't have a line which is drawn backward. What we do here is we execute what's called an exit segue. We're going to control drag from the save button into this little exit icon here. That's how we handle our unwind. We'll be asked to select a function to run when we unwind. So this will get us back here. The unwind function will take a look and it will look back at the value that we'd updated here, our catch value. And it will either put this into the value that was selected if we have a selected value, which means that we passed it over when we did a show segue, or if we don't have a value that's selected, then you must have gone over from clicking on a plus, which means this is a new element, which means we're going to add it to the end of our array. So let's see how we do this. We actually have to implement things in reverse order because we can't go ahead and set up a segue to an unwind unless we write the unwind. So we're going to write the fourth element first. So we'll go back to viewcontroller.swift and make sure that you're inside of your student list. inside, right underneath our prepare for segue, before the curly that ends the class, we're going to create an unwind function. Now the unwind function is going to be an IB action, and every IB action that we've created up until this point has been something that we've control dragged over. This is the first time that we're just writing IB actions straight into our function, but we'll do that for unwind. This is going to be a function, and we're going to call this unwind. Now you could call it anything you want, but unwind is a good programming practice for something which is going to be an unwind function that's executing when you're unwinding from a previous view controller, and we'll say unwind from detail view controller. Now this takes a parameter. It's the same parameter that you have here. So this segue parameter here, so we can actually just grab what's inside of prepare for segue and then paste it right into here down below. And just if you've opened the curly, then close your curly down here. So we've just set this up, everything we need to in our unwind segue. Now let's code. Now the first thing that we want to do is figure out where we're coming from. So when we went from this view controller to our detail, this was the source and the detail was the destination. Now we're coming back from the detail, so the detail is the source and this is the destination. And again, in main storyboard terms, when we do a prepare for segue from here to here, source, destination. When we come back via unwind, this is the source and this is the destination. So inside of our unwind, we're going to, instead of getting the destination, we're going to get the source. So we'll say let source equal segue dot source. In the same way there's a destination property, there's a source property. As we'll do the same thing here, we'll set it to the student detail view controller. Then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to check to see if we have a selection in our table view. So we're actually going to perform this same line right here. We're going to check to see if we can create a selected index path for the table view index path for selected row. And I just copied that. I'm going to put a curly afterward. If this is the case, if we have a selected index path, then remember, if we clicked on plus, we cleared out the selected index path. So the only way we've got a selected index path is if you had a show detail, you clicked on a table view cell. So that click is still selected. So what are we going to do here? We're going to update whatever cell was selected, which is now your selected index path. So what are we going to update? Our students array at selected index path.row, and we're going to update that with our source dot student. That's what we're passing back. Now once we've updated this, we want to reload the row that we updated. So we're going to say TableView dot reload rows, and unfortunately there's not a reload row, so we have to execute reload rows, and in brackets we'll pass in just a single index path, the index path that we're going to update, which is selected index path. So it's got to be inside of brackets, but we'll say selected index path, which is this one right here, and then with is just an animation. If you do dot, you'll get a bunch of different options. I'll do automatic. Now what happens if we don't have a selected row? Well, that must mean that we've either cleared out the row or we at least have not clicked on show detail to get over here. So we're coming back after having clicked on the plus button. So there is no selection, because if you click on the plus button, we clear out any selection. So what are we going to do in here? Well, we are going to add a record to the end of students, which is still source.student, but instead of updating this value, we're going to add a value to the end. First thing we need to do is we need to create a new index path. That's the index path at the end of our table view cells. So we've got a place to put this value, because again, it's a new value. So we'll say let new index path equals, and then if we say upper camel case index path here, we're creating a new index path. So I'll select that, open parentheses. We're going to pass in a row and a section. We don't have a section, so we'll put a 0 in there. But what is our row going to be? Well, our row is going to be, it's going to be the number of elements in our array. And the reason for that is the first element is 0, and the other is number of elements minus 1. So if we say students.count, This is going to create one after the students.count minus one element, which is the last element. So this will create a new last element, which is one more than the last element index, which is students.count minus one. And we'll put in a 0 here for the section. Now that we've created this, we want to append the value that we're getting from our source to the end of students. So we'll say students dot append, the element will be source dot student. Now we've got our new index path. Now we've updated the element. So what we want to do is insert the new row into our table view and then scroll to that row. So we'll say table view dot insert, and again there's an insert rows, there's not an insert row, so we've got to just put a single index path in between brackets here, but we'll say open bracket and then index path, lower camel case, close brackets, with, what is our animation? Well, let's make it bottom since we're adding it to the bottom, and then we'll scroll to that index path. So we'll say table view dot scroll to row at index path, new index path. Whoops, I'm sorry, up here I shouldn't have said insert rows at index path. I should have said insert it at new index path. Then we'll scroll to new index path. At scroll position, what are the scroll positions? If I do a dot in here, oh, bottom is one of them. And should we animate? Yeah, we'll say true in here. So this is what we need. Now, if we take a look at our code, what's going to change? It's going to be in green. Well, you might have a different name for your unwind, but most of the time you might say, unwind from detail view controller. What is the name of your view controller? What's the data structure for the catch value as well as the array that you've got? So that's what you're going to update here and here as well as here when you create your new index path at whatever the array value is .count. And the value that you append to. But other than that, this is going to be the same from project to project. Now this is just the first bit we've got to do. Remember the other steps. Well, we've got to grab everything and prepare for segue in our detail view controller. So we've got to add that prepare for segue that takes everything out of the interface elements and updates our catch value. And then we've got to create the segue. So let's go back over into our code. Now we're in student detail view controller. We don't have a prepare for segue in here, so we need to add one. So I'm going to do that just before my cancel button pressed function. I'll type prepare. Again, this is an Apple function, so Apple will write the stub for me if I press enter on prepare for segue. Then what am I going to do? Well, up here we set the interface up by grabbing whatever was in student and putting it in student detail field .text. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to update student, which is our catch value, this guy here, with whatever the user typed into student text field.text. Because before we segue, we want to make sure that we get whatever the user typed in. So first, we passed over whatever value we clicked on, but the user may have updated this. So then we grab whatever's in here, we put it in our catch value, and then remember we use that when we do the source value, and we either add it to the end or we add whatever was selected. So our prepare for segue is set. The last thing we need to do is we need to set our segue, but you'll never do an arrow in the other direction as your unwind. You're always going to do this. Up here in our dock area of this view controller is an exit, and we want to drag from whichever value is going to exit back to the original view controller. We'll control drag from here to that exit, let go. Look what shows up here, the name of the IB action we can do as part of our unwind. That's this guy here. Now let's build and run and see how things work. Click on Mother of Dragons. Let's change her name to Dani. I don't know how they spell it in the show, but let's assume it's going to be D-A-N-I like this. And then we'll click on save. What's going to happen? Well, when I click on save, I'm going to execute a segue. But before I do that, I'm going to run a prepare for segue. That's this prepare for segue in student detail view controller. That's going to go into whatever my student text field is, which is this one here. It's going to grab what's inside of the text property, which is Danny Targaryen now, update our student value, which is our catch value. So I click on save. What happens here with the save is it executes the exit segue and runs the unwind code that's in my view controller. So I click on save. What does this code look like? Back in my view controller, it goes and takes a look and says, hey, all right, first get the source, which was the student detail view controller. Then, was there a selected index path? Did you have a selected table view? We did. It was Daenerys Targaryen. So that was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth index value down here. So since we did have a value here and it wasn't nil, then we updated students at selectedindexpath.row, which is 5, with source.student, which we just updated in our prepare for segue, which now is Danny Targaryen. Then we reload table view rows at the selected index path. It's a single row in there automatically, and boom, we see Danny Targaryen in here. Let's see if we add somebody else. So I'll click on plus. Who should we add here? How about Mark Zuckerberg? So when I click on save, what's going to happen? Well, first of all, when I clicked on plus, in my prepare for segue, in view controller Swift, the previous view controller, I went in and said, hey, did you click on show detail? No, because when you click on plus, it's not show detail, it's add detail. Then I said, hey, was there a selected index path? There was. It was Daenerys Targaryen, so I deselected her name. So now I've got no selection. All right. Now I'm updating Zuckerberg. What happens when I click on save? Well, back here in detail, I execute prepare for segue. I grab Mark Zuckerberg out of student detail.text and put it into student, which is our catch value. Cool. And then, so that's my prepare for segue. Then I click on save. Save segues me back and executes the unwind segue in my view controller. So boom, click on save. What happens in unwind segue? First we get the source. Then we say, hey, is there a selected index path? There is not, because we clicked on plus. So that's when we went down here and we did our deselection. So that's why we do this. We deselect to make sure that we're not going to update Daenerys Targaryen with Mark Zuckerberg, because we go down here and we say, do we have a selected value? No, because we just deselected when we clicked on plus, so we don't have Danny Targaryen in here. So if we don't have a selected index path, what do? We jump down to where else, we create a new index path, which is at students.count, which is one past the very last element. The last element was Grey Worm. Then we append source.student, which was the Mark Zuckerberg value that we just updated and prepared for segue. We insert it to the end of our student's value. Then we insert the row to hold this into our table view at new index path, which is the index path we created up here. And you want to make sure that you create your index path first before doing the append. Otherwise, you're going to have an extra value in here and you're going to get an index out of range. So this order is important. Then we scroll so that you can see Zuckety Zuck right down here. Nice work. Everything's working perfectly. Now it's your chance to apply this in Party Planner. So here we are inside of our Party Planner. Let's go ahead and make sure that everything is set up in terms of our IB outlets. So we should have an IB outlet for these two text fields here. I'll click on Detail View Controller. Do we have outlets set up? We do, for an item text field and a person responsible, so we're good. What do we need to do now? Let's write our unwind first. Remember, we work backwards. So in our View Controller.swift, what we can do is create an unwind that's almost identical to the one that we created previously. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to grab my whole unwind from detail view controller that I created inside of my student list, copy it with a Command C, head back over to my Party Planner, paste it in with a Command V. Now what's going to change here? Well, we'll see red marks next to everything I need to change. First is my source is not student detail, it's detail view controller.swift. I don't have a students array in here. I have an array which is called Party Planner list. So I'll replace that. I don't have a student value in here. I have in my source do I have my party list item? Let's take a look. Yep, it should be called Party Planner list item. So let's go back over here under source. Party planner list item. Good. My index, new index path is going to be not students.count. It's going to be party planner list.count. I'm going to append not into students, but into party planner list. And I'm not going to append the student.source. I'm going to append my student.party planner list item. Everything else is the same, looking good. Now let's head over to our detail view controller. We need to add a prepare for segue. The prepare for segue is going to do the opposite of this. So I'm going to grab these two lines, copy them down below, and I'm going to go and take the value that's in my item text field .text and put it inside of my party planner list item .item. This wants me to go ahead and unwrap this. That's totally fine for me to force unwrap it. I'm going to do the same down here. I'm going to create party planner list item .person responsible from the value in this text field, force unwrapped. And now that I've done this, I can go over to main storyboard and I can create my exit segue, control dragging from my save into my exit value here. Come on, let me do that. You got to click on save and do it. So again, initially I wasn't clicking on the save button. Let go. Here's my unwind. Let's now go ahead and build and run and see how things look. In our view controller.swift, if we click on salsa and we go over here, all right, who's the person that's responsible for salsa? Let's say Cheryl Sandberg is going to give us salsa. What happens when we click on save? Well, we should unwind from here. We should say, hey, was there a selection? There should be a selection for Cheryl Sandberg because we kept the selection in here because that was our show detail. Then what are we going to do? Well, we should update whatever was selected, which is Cheryl Sandberg, or I'm sorry, which is salsa, and we should add Cheryl Sandberg in there as our new party item, and then we should reload that selected item. Let's see. Boom! There's Cheryl Sandberg, and notice she's added below. So our table view cell for this one shows our detail text label right down here. Looking good. Well, what if Zuck wants to show up? And Mark Zuckerberg, for a period of time, had this crazy thing that people were doing in Silicon Valley where he would only eat meat that he killed. So you'll have to ask him about that and why he did that. But, he also ran a Game of Thrones party where he had goat. So let's imagine we invite Zuck, and Zuck goes ahead in here and says, okay, goat he wants to bring. That's Mark Zuckerberg, so we'll say Zuck. And what happens when we click on save? When we clicked on plus, we didn't go from show details, so we deselected Cheryl Sandberg. So when we come back, Cheryl Sandberg's salsa is not selected. So we're going to create that new index path. We're going to append the value to the end. We're going to insert it to the end, and we're going to scroll to the end. Let's see if that's what we're doing with the Zuck goat. We do have that down here. Is Sandberg up here? She still is. So this is working perfectly. Hopefully you got that, Swifter.